Hey there, this is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and the purpose of this video is to give you an overview of a cycling-specific FTP boosting plan that you've purchased in the Training Peaks Training Plan store. For this video, I'm going to be using a beginner 8-week FTP boosting plan. The video is applicable to all levels of this plan, so there's 3 different levels of 8-week FTP boosting plans on the bike, and there's going to be beginner, intermediate, and advanced level plans. Everything I'm going to go over is generalizable across the 3 different levels of plans. I'll point out any subtle differences if any come up, but really the primary difference is obviously the intensity level of the plans based on which level it is. So beginner plans obviously are a little bit more intense, maybe sessions are a little bit shorter, the volume doesn't get quite as high as intermediate or advanced level plans. But all of the plans are going to look the same. For the most part, you're going to see 3 or 4 bike sessions per week in here, and you're going to have a couple note cards in there throughout to pay attention to as you go. Starting on day 1, whichever day you download this plan and upload into your calendar to have the starting day as, on that first day is going to be an introduction note card to start with. So hopefully this is what you start with, and you review this video first. So this will be the video that you're watching right now, where I'm just giving you an overview of the plan and some of the features that it has. And then I have you get your resting heart rate either the next morning, or if you know your resting heart rate via wearable devices. It's really common nowadays for a lot of athletes to have, Garmin's or Coros watches or polar heart rate monitors that they wear overnight, or Whoop straps, things like that. If you know what your kind of average resting overnight heart rate is, just use that. That's going to be a little bit more accurate than you measuring it at the first thing in the morning when you wake up. But I do give instructions on how to do that if you choose to go that route if you don't wear a device overnight. I also have in here a PDF to an RPE table. So if you click on this, it's going to take you to a rating of perceived exertion table, which is how I prescribe intensity using an RPE scale. Now in all of these bike sessions within these plans, it's prescribed based on a percentage of your functional threshold power. But I do leave in the notes like what RPE that should feel like, or what the rating of perceived exertion should feel like. There are different types of RPE scales and different ways of kind of setting them up. Some people use a 0 to 10 scale, some people use a 6 to 20 scale. I like this 1 to 10 scale where kind of structured exercise intensity starts at 3 to 4. But this scale is a little bit different depending on if you've worked with coaches in the past or if you have a different type of RPE scale that you prefer. So this just puts some context to the numbers that you will see in the sessions if you're not familiar with this style of RPE table. So just give this a quick look over. You don't necessarily have to go off of the RPE numbers that I list in the training sessions. But if you do look at those numbers and you want to kind of have RPE in the back of your mind as a way to gauge intensity while you're doing the workouts, then at least you'll have the context behind what like an RPE of 3 to 4 or 5 to 6 means. So you'll see with all the sessions that they're going to be prescribed based on a percentage of FTP for a certain duration, and then in the notes there's going to be like what RPE it's at. So you'll see that a lot. So this will just help you understand what those numbers mean. And then once you're done with day 1, reviewing that introduction note card, on day 2 is going to be a bike-specific FTP test. So this will be across all levels of plans. You'll have the exact same FTP test. It's just a pretty classic 20-minute all-out time trial effort. And then from there, you'll multiply that by 95% and you'll get your FTP. And we can also do the same thing and get functional threshold heart rate as well, so you kind of know what your threshold heart rate is. So if you've never done an FTP test before, so if you're, for example, a beginner level plan and maybe you've never done an FTP test before, even if you've done a few, just take a look through these notes. I kind of go over what threshold is. There's still some misconceptions around like what threshold is and like what lactate is and the purpose of lactate and what actually causes fatigue and things like that. So I give just a really brief background in here, and then I link to a video in which I go over your anaerobic threshold, or sometimes what's known as lactate threshold, in more detail so you can learn a little bit more about it. Because it is such a common term to be used nowadays, and we obviously prescribe training intensity based on people's threshold numbers, threshold power, threshold pace, but sometimes people don't necessarily understand what it is. So just understanding what it is in more detail can sometimes help you as you're approaching these tests and in knowing how to use the data that you get from the tests. So I go over that here, and then I cover how to determine your FTP and threshold heart rate once you've completed the test. So this test is prescribed based on perceived exertion, because obviously we're not basing it off of power numbers. We want you to just go as hard as you can for the most part in that 20-minute time trial effort. So everything is based on perceived exertion. So this is where knowing those perceived exertion numbers and what they mean will be helpful at the very least for this FTP test. And then once you, I'll take one step back. When doing this test, the goal should be to go through a thorough warm-up and then do a 20-minute time trial in which it's uninterrupted. So for this sort of workout or test, for a lot of people, the most ideal way to do it, where you can kind of control all the variables and you can keep the test route and set up the same when you do it again in the future, is to do this on an indoor trainer. If you have access to a cycling route or a road that you know you can do 20 minutes uninterrupted and you don't have to worry about cars, traffic, or stopping at lights, or having to coast or freewheel because there's significant downhills, then you can do it outside. But just if you do it outside, obviously being exposed to temperature elements and things like that, if you do this test on day one and it's really cool, there's no wind, perfect conditions, and you get your FTP, but then if you do this again at the end of the 8-week test and it's like 20 degrees hotter, it's a lot windier, there's other variables to consider, maybe it's really humid, your FTP might not increase in the raw objective number, even though you might be fitter, but you were just hindered by the elements. So typically for most people, the best way to do this is to do it on an indoor trainer. But if you are someone who really does not like an indoor trainer and you want to do this outside, just make sure that you find a relatively flat route where you can constantly be applying power to the pedals. And then make sure that if you do it, you kind of make note of what the temperature and conditions were. And then when you replicate this test again at the end of this plan, you just want to be able to reference what those conditions were, so that if the conditions when you repeat it are significantly worse or significantly better, then you have a little bit more context behind the numbers. Because obviously the elements, the weather, humidity, temperature, wind, things like that does impact what power you can produce on a given day, regardless of your fitness level, even if it hasn't changed or if it's increased or decreased. So just keep that in mind. If you do this on the trainer, make sure, again, you pick a relatively flat route if you're doing something like Ruvi or Zwift or Training Peaks Virtual. Just make sure it's a flat route where, again, you can keep applying pressure to the pedals and power to the pedals. And if you do it indoors, you typically won't have to worry about, obviously, the environmental conditions, because it's going to be more than likely the same conditions inside of your house each time you do it, unless the humidity levels change drastically where you live from week 1 to week 8, then maybe it's more humid inside or less humid. And then if you do it indoors as well, just make sure that you have the same setup when you replicate this test 8 weeks from now. So if you have a fan blowing, make sure you have the fan. If you don't have a fan, don't use the fan when you retest. So just try and make sure, for the purpose of getting reliable testing data that can be repeated, that you keep the testing route and the setup as close to the same as possible. And then once you're done with that, you'll have a power number, you'll have an average heart rate for the 20 minutes, and then you can go down here and I give you instructions on how to set up your training zones based on your estimated functional threshold power and threshold heart rate. So I give a little bit more detail on how to do that in Training Peaks as well, but I also include a training zones Excel spreadsheet that can be useful. So I have that up here. First off, I have a Training Peaks power profile chart. This is more just if you're curious as to how you rank. So this just kind of shows people what their relative functional threshold power is. So that's going to be your power divided by your weight in kilograms. So this would be your watts per kilogram. It just kind of shows you how you rank. Some people are interested in this, others, they might not care. But this is here if you're interested. Just kind of shows you where you rank. And then if you go to the training zones, cycling specific, blank Excel spreadsheet, this will be where you can actually calculate heart rate ranges, power, and get suggested pace ranges for triathlon different distances. I know obviously some people doing this plan may be just specifically road cyclists or like crit racers, or they do Gran Fondos, or maybe they just ride their bike for fun and they don't race. But this does give some pace ranges if you do triathlon and you want to have an idea of like what some target Ironman 70.3 Olympic or sprint distance power numbers might be based on your FTP. But I suggest plugging your numbers in here because it makes it pretty easy to see all of your training zones in one place and all of your data. It's fairly straightforward to use. You plug in your age. Let's say you're 35. Let's say your resting heart rate is 50. You'll see you already have heart rate zones calculated. And then if you plug in here, you don't really need your functional threshold pace, but if you're interested, if you do this outside on the exact same route, each time you do this test, you could get your average miles per hour, multiply it by 0.95 and get your functional threshold speed, like on a perfectly flat road, if you ride on a perfectly flat road. And then you could test again, and if your FTP goes up, you could see how that reflects your speed in terms of your functional threshold speed. But again, there's so many weather conditions and environmental factors that affect speed that it, for the most part, isn't usually a metric that people keep track of. But if you are interested, you could write down your functional threshold pace or speed here and track it over time as well. You'll have your functional threshold heart rate and your functional threshold power. So if you plug in power, let's say it's 200 watts, you'll see your zones update. And I like to use this 8-zone model, but also I have over here how the 8 zones fall into place with zone 1 through 5 on a typical 1 through 5 zone training model. So typically for like perceived exertion, heart rate, it's all based on 5 zones for the most part. I like to keep it simple and just keep it to 5 zones. That's what most people are familiar with. Wherein I know a lot of days, especially like cycling power, like running power zones, those can sometimes be 7, 8, 9 different zones. I do like the 8-zone setup for cycling power, but you can see here that like zone 1 consists of just this first row, zone 2, just the second row of power. Zone 3 kind of encompasses these 2 rows. It's just further broken down into different types of, or like layers of the zones. Like this would be kind of an easy zone 3 effort. This would be like an up tempo zone 3 effort. And then you have 2 zone 4 rows right here. So one that's kind of like threshold E, like right above, below, or at, and then above threshold. And then you have zone 5, which are these last 2 rows. So you can see some of the power ranges overlap a little bit. So there's a little bit of redundancy, but this is a zone. I like to use these just because it gives a little bit more nuanced breakdown of the zones and like what type of ride or effort it is. So this is how I use this chart. And then you can take this data and plug it directly into Training Peaks if you go to your settings. So when you go to your settings to update your training zones, which I go over down here, you'll be able to go in there and either manually enter training zones, which is what I would recommend. But if you have specific ways of calculating your training zones that you're used to, you can obviously do that yourself. You don't have to go off of what I provide. That's just the way that I do it, the way that I use it with athletes I coach, and the way that I do it for all these training plans that I have available. So set it up however you want, but as long as it's something that is, reliable and you use over time and you know it works well for you, then you can use whatever you want. And then once you've done that, all of your workouts then will populate with power numbers to target for your different sessions. So once you have the FTP test done, then you can actually get into the rest of the plan where you can follow the sessions week to week. And you'll notice over the course of the 8 weeks, obviously, there's some slight progressions as you go in terms of like weekly volume, training intensity level of some of the sessions. Some of the sessions that are harder do progress. And then for intermediate and advanced level plans, there may be the occasional 4th bike session thrown in here. And then at the very end, you'll see there's a note in here about retesting week or recovery leading into your retest. And then you basically just replicate the same test at the end of the plan. And again, this plan is designed to improve your functional threshold power. So most of the training, or all of the training sessions, are kind of focused around that goal. And I do typically work mostly with triathletes. So these are in here for the way that this is laid out, and the reason there might only be 3 or 4 bike rides per week is because I'm used to working with triathletes, and they typically have to fit in swimming, running, and potentially strength training as well. So that's why usually there's only 3 or 4 sessions at most. If you're a pure road cyclist, especially if you go to something like an advanced level plan, let's see, training plans. If you go to advanced, you'll notice that there's 4 sessions for the most part each week. But for a pure road cyclist, that still isn't necessarily a lot. Some pure road cyclists will ride 5, 6, 7 days a week. If that is you and you really want to do this plan, but it's just not enough like frequency for you, you're obviously welcome to add in like additional short, easy or aerobic sessions. If that's something that you're just used to doing and you just want a little bit of structured guidance around improving your threshold. But obviously, even if you are a pure road cyclist, these will still potentially improve your threshold even at the frequency that's in here. But if you are used to like biking 6, 7 days a week and you're doing 10, 15, 20 hours a week and you're a pure road cyclist, this plan might not be quite enough for you, just because the volume isn't quite high enough for those pure road cyclists that are used to doing, 10, 20 hours a week of cycling. But I doubt you'd be going to Training Peaks for a plan like this anyways if that is you. And then also I do note that this is Zwift compatible, so it's probably compatible with other online virtual cycling platforms as well. I've just only ever really used Zwift personally, but this is compatible with Zwift in the sense that you can go into Zwift, you can pull up the specific bike workout to do, and then just follow along to it on Zwift. So these do upload right to Zwift so you can follow them, and it's nice and easy and convenient. If you ever have any questions on the plan, like about the individual sessions or some of the features or components that are included with the plan, you can always feel free to reach out to me via email. It should be in my Training Peaks training plan library, like coaching profile, but it is peakenduranceSolutions@outlook.com, and I am more than happy to answer any questions that you might have as you complete this plan.